Hi, I'm Rakisha, an instructor at Sew Creative Lounge. For today's project, we'll be making this super cute and functional double wine carrier. Grab all your materials and meet me at the cutting table. Okay, let's get started. For the double wine tote, the supplies you'll need are 2 fat quarters, some fusible interfacing or fleece. And it doesn't necessarily have to be fusible. Use what you have on hand, but you definitely want your bag to be sturdy and have some good substance to it. And then something for your straps. You could choose to make some from fabric. We're using our nylon webbing today, and these pieces are cut to be about 1 yard each. So now with the fat quarters, they typically run 22 inches by 18 inches. But for the wine tote, we're gonna cut ours down to measure out to be 12.5 inches by 22 inches. So we'll keep the length of the fat quarter, but it's gonna trim it down a little bit so it's not quite as wide. So that 18-inch side, trim that down to 12.5. So we'll do that for both prints, our main and our lining, as well as our interface pieces. So everything gets trimmed down to 12.5 by 22. Now, since we're using fusible interfacing, the next thing we want to do is fuse the interfacing to the wrong side of our fabric pieces. So let's find the bumpy side, or the side that has the adhesive on it, not the smooth fleece side, but the side that has the adhesive. We're going to put this face down on the wrong side of our fabric. So with your African print fabric, both sides are usually pretty richly printed, but you can decide which is going to be your wrong side. I think for this piece, we'll use this side. And then for our black and white, let's say the wrong side is this side. And I've got my adhesive side face down on the wrong side of my fabric. Let's heat up our iron and press the interfacing down so that it adheres. So now it's time to press to fuse the interfacing to the wrong side of our fabric. As you're pressing, just apply even heat, even dry heat to your fabric, moving your iron along the piece. If you get to an edge, it's probably also a good idea to protect your iron and your pressing surface with a pressing cloth. So just a piece of 100% cotton fabric. We use some of our remnant scraps here. So I'm gonna fuse this edge with my pressing cloth. That way none of the adhesive gets on my iron as I'm fusing the two together. All that glue can stay right on this pressing cloth and not gunk up my iron. All right, let's do the same thing with the other piece. Okay, so now that both pieces have been fused, it's time to assemble our bags. So at this point, we're gonna assemble the bags, and you'll want to use either your pins or your clips, whatever works best for you. But we're just gonna fold this piece in half and clip on the short sides. Gonna clip along here, leaving the top open. With right sides together. Maybe you can start at that fold, flatten everything out. Just put a few clips, maybe 3 or 4, just to hold everything together when you go to sew it. Now let's do the same thing with the other bag. I'll take the entire rectangle, fold it in half, right sides together. The fusible interfacing is on the outside. And we're gonna clip along the sides, leaving the top open. And this will create the body of our bag. All right, both bags are clipped. Let's go to the sewing machine. So now we're gonna sew the side seams of our bags. So where we've clipped, we're gonna sew just straight along those raw edges on both bags, back stitching at the start and the stop of that stitch. And we're gonna use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Start over, do the same thing on the other side. That's one bag. We'll do the same thing with the second bag. So both bags have been prepped. Now let's go ahead and prep our straps while we're here. So for the straps, if you're using the webbing, we're going to make our strap a little bit more sturdy by doubling it over. And in order to keep that secure, we're just going to edge stitch right along the edge here. And we're going to leave about 2 to 3 inches free at the bottom, or the top and the bottom, or each edge. So that it can securely go down inside of the bag to be attached. But all the rest of the length of the webbing, we're going to double it over. If you're using fabric to create your own straps, you may want to consider doubling it as well, or maybe interfacing it so that it's a little bit more sturdy. Because again, we're going to be carrying 2 wine bottles, which could get kind of heavy. So you want to make sure that your straps are pretty sturdy and secure. If you need to keep it in place, you can go ahead and clip here, just right along the edge, keeping our straps folded over in half. The key here is making sure that your edges line up. You don't want any overlap where one is shorter or longer than the other. They both should meet right at that edge so that they can get stitched together. It's going to be a nice clean seamed finish. So it looks like I'm leaving 3 inches from the bottom, and I'll start my stitch here. And again, I'm gonna back stitch at the beginning and the end. And here, I just want to stitch right along this edge of the fabric, of the webbing. So right along the edge, like a top stitch. Once I get to the end, again, leaving about 3 inches unstitched, I'll backstitch to reinforce. And then the first strap is complete. And we're going to do the same thing with our other strap. If you feel comfortable, you don't necessarily have to pin it here, or pin or clip it to hold it together. You could also do the same thing just with your fingers as you're pinching yourself down the length of the strap. So for this one, since we pinned the first or clipped the first one, I'll go ahead and stitch this one so that we can get back to assembling the bag. You want to just take your time if you're not using the pins, just making sure that there's no overlap, that both of the raw edges meet up flush along this edge so they both get caught in that stitch. Back stitch and then cut it off. And so now both of my straps have been prepped. So now we've got straps that are ready, we've got bags that are ready. Let's go back to the cutting table so that we can box our corners. So now we're going to box our corners. And what that means, we're literally going to create a box so that when we stitch this together, the bottom of our bag will sit flat as opposed to being rounded here. So you'll see what that looks like in a second. So just trust the process, as Carrie likes to say, and follow along. So this is where you want to grab your marking tools, either a piece of chalk or a marker and a straight edge. What I'm going to do, I'm going to use a Sharpie so that it shows up really well in the camera. And so for this particular bag, because it's relatively small, we're going to give it about 1.5 inches. So I'm going to put 1.5 inches here, 1.5 inches here, and then I'll just draw my box. Okay, same thing on the other side. And at this point, what we'll end up doing, we're gonna sew right across this edge here. So how I got to this point, from the bag being laid flat, I've drawn this box in each corner. I wanna pick up the bag, and I'll just put my hand on the open side, and I'm gonna pinch up the folded edge. Just pretend that the folded edge is a seam line. And we wanna make that part, this seam line, meet up with this seam line that we actually created. So I put my hand inside, take my fold line, and pinch my bag so that it meets up with the seam that we created. And then we just want to flatten everything out right along that corner of the box that we drew. And so now, when I go to the machine, I'm just going to sew straight across, continuing this line here. Okay? So while I have it, I'm gonna go ahead and put a couple pins just to hold it down flat, and I'll show you the process again on the other bag. So you can kind of see the bag coming together already. And it's gonna be able to sit up on its own with those corners that are boxed, making a flat bottom to the bag. So let's box the other corners. So to repeat that process, and I'll show you more precisely on the grid lines this time, we wanna make markings at the 1.5 inch mark. So from the edge of my bag, from my stitch line, 1.5 inch mark. I'll put a dot there, and we'll go midway here. And I'll just use my straight edge to connect those lines. And we're gonna do the same thing on the other side. So from here, going to 1.5 inches. And we'll also get 1.5 inches here. And we're gonna connect the lines. Okay, now it's time to create the box. When we go to do that, we're gonna go inside the bag. We're gonna pinch up the fold line or that imaginary seam line to meet up with our actual seam line at the corner of the box that we drew. So pinch everything up to that corner, flatten it out. So you almost end up with like a little dog ear here. Flatten everything out. And then for the visual, if you're a visual person, we can go ahead and extend that line. This is gonna be where we're gonna sew when we take it to the machine. So I'm gonna put a pin in place just to hold it for us. And let's do the same thing on the other side. Pinching up that fold line to my seam line, meeting at the corners. Extending my stitching line, and a pin to hold it in place. And so now, let's take it to the machine. Now to box the corners. What we want to do in this step is we're going to sew right across the line that we created, across this little dog-eared corner. And that's going to create the boxing that will make our bag lay flat, or stand flat, once it's together, once it's assembled. Okay? So we're going to just sew straight across this line, back stitching at the start and the stop of the stitch. So here's what that looks like once it's done. Let's do it for all 4 corners. So that's for one part of the bag. Let's do it for the second bag. All 4 corners have been boxed. And at this point, what we can do, we can trim away this excess. the part that's on the opposite side away from the bag, we can trim that away. We no longer need it. And it'll also help to have a nice clean finish on those corners once we put our two bags together. And you just want to trim about 1/4 of an inch from that seam allowance. Not too close. And so that's what you'll have. And now it's time to assemble our bags. Let's go back to the cutting table. So at this point, we've got our bags one inside the other. And if you have any issues with your raw edges, like if they look a little wonky or one's a little bit longer than the other, feel free to clean all of that up right now, either with your scissors or your rotary blade. But once you've got them inside of the other, where the lining, you can see the lining fabric on the inside, your outer fabric is right side out, and your interfacings are both facing one another. What you want to do is take each layer and just tuck the raw edge down about 1/4 of an inch to the inside that interfacing layer. So for example, here's my lining piece that goes down inside. And on the other side, my outer is gonna meet up side by side with my lining piece. So all the way around, we're tucking both layers to the inside. You can see that up close. Okay. So you decide if it's easier for you to tuck your lining piece all the way around and then your outer piece all the way around. For me, because I'll be using the clips, I'm gonna tuck each side as I go. That way I can make sure that they're both kissing up right next to one another. There's no issues with measurement. You can just eyeball it and just pin about 2 or 3 inches down as you go. Pin or clip as you go, turning it all the way around. Now, once I get to my side seams, I think I'd like to either push these to one side or the other so that those seams meet up there, or feel free to open them up flat and let them meet up that way, whichever works best for you. But again, we're going to be tucking this down. So think about what's going to create the least amount of bulk, I think. So I'm going to leave them one side or the other. Tucking that down, turning this one down. And then that way my side seams still meet up, but that bulk that's created by the seam allowance is distributed to one side or the other. I'll be sure to put a clip there to start flattening those pieces out. And you just want to tuck and clip all the way around until your entire top is finished. Back at the side seam again. I'll turn those seam allowances one to my right side, the other one's going to my left. And then I'll tuck those edges down and just nestle those two right side by side. And my seam allowance still lines up, my side seam still lines up perfectly, one side and the other. As you get to the side seams, there may be a little bit of bulk there. So again, with turning one set of seam allowances to one side and the other to the other, just take your time. And if it's too thick for your clips, you may need to put a pin there or just put your clips on one side or the other of that bulk so that you can still connect those two pieces of fabric. And now we're almost back to where we started. And so now you can see that our entire bag has been clipped. All those raw edges are now tucked away on the inside. And so while we're here, let's go ahead and attach the straps as well. So for these straps, we want to measure in about 2 inches from the outside to where the straps need to be placed. And because our raw edges are already set the way that they're going to be sewn, we're basically just going to top stitch around this entire perimeter, the top of the bag. And our straps just going to go right in where they belong. So let's measure in about 2 inches from that side seam. And we'll slide in one strap. And so you see where the flat part of the strap that we didn't sew comes in handy. And I'll put a pin here to secure that. And let's do the same thing on the other side. Measuring in 2 inches from that stitch, that side seam. We're going to slide that right on in there. And let's just eyeball to make sure that where we started our stitch lines up on both straps. Put another pin to secure. And we're going to do the same thing on the other side of the bag. And here, on this side, you won't have to measure because you'll have your other straps as your starting points. So I'm going to do the same thing here. And I have the inside of that curved side of my strap facing the inside of my bag. So you'll see the flat part on top. So I'm going to match this side here. Let's just clean this up a little bit. We're going to slide that down in between those 2 layers. And it's lined up against this other strap on the other side. Placing my pin to hold it in place. And our last strap. Slide it down in there. And we can see that our loops are about the same size. And so we know where that strap needs to finish. Got it slid in place. Now I'm going to pin it. Okay, so while we're here, let's find the midpoint of our bag so that we can create or chalk in our stitch line, and that way we can divide the bag for each bottle of wine to fit in nicely without clanking up against one another, right? So here it looks like this bag is measuring at about 10 inches finished. So we're gonna measure in 5 inches and then just put a little chalk mark on the outside of the bag. And our stitch line is going to be 6 inches long. So I'm just going to put another little chalk dot where I'm going to stop. So now what we want to do is close up our bag by creating a top stitch that's going to secure our straps and also give it a nice decorative finishing at the top of the bag. So we're going to sew 1 stitch all the way around at about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we're going to back stitch at the at the end once we come all the way around the bag. If you need to, you can go ahead and remove this piece from your sewing machine so that your bag can rotate freely all the way around. Load it into the machine, making sure that my tops stay right where I've pinned them in place. And you want to take your time at this point because we've got quite a few layers of fabric that we're sewing through, so it's gotten a little bit thicker than it was before. If your machine doesn't like it as much, take your time. You might have to hand walk your wheel over some bulkier places, or even consider using a bigger needle. Maybe go to your denim needle or a longer stitch length. Whatever you need to do to get through this thickness. So you decide, your machine best. I've increased my stitch length, and I'm also flattening this out as much as I can as I go. So let's just take our time. Making sure to go through all the layers. So we've got the top layer is folded under our strap and the bottom layer is folded under. So that's about 5 layers of material for this needle to go through. So take your time, especially as you get to those thicker intersections. And now I'm back to where I started. I just want to do a quick back stitch. And the top stitching is complete. So we can take a look. Let's double check our straps. Make sure they're in there, they're secured. Nothing pops out on us. And now for the last stitch, we're going to connect the dots on that 6-inch seam that's going to create our divider where our 2 wine bottles can go, or our wine bottle and our glass. So I'm going to make sure that I match up my midpoint markings on the top and the bottom. And I'm just going to stitch straight down, back stitching at the start and stop of my seam. Again, taking your time as you feed this through your machine because there are 5 layers at the top of this fabric. Also be mindful to keep your straps out of the way. You don't want to stitch your straps down to your backs. I'm going to move mine up to the top where I can see them, that they're not underneath and getting sewn to my bag. So here at the top, I want to back stitch. Sew a few stitches and back stitch. Then we're going to go sew straight down the middle to meet up with that other chalk mark that we made that's 6 inches down from the top. Once I reach my chalk mark, I'm going to back stitch and cut my thread, and that's it. There you have it. Well, we are all done. I hope you love your double wine carrier. Now it's time to stuff it. Grab your bottle of wine and cheers to the holiday season.